I really have to give it to David and Diane Munson. You know, it's not every day that you pick up a book that someone wrote and think, what the, on every sentence. This is Night Flight by David and Diane Munson. Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you another book to decide, is it worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. Today's book is Night Flight by David and Diane Munson. It was published on August 20th, 2012, at least according to Amazon. That was the only site that gave me a complete date, but 2012 was the general date that I found everywhere else, such as Goodreads and stuff like that. What's interesting about the authors is both of them have federal backgrounds, with David Munson being a former NCIS/DEA agent, and Diane being a former federal prosecutor. This sort of ties in a bit, but really you don't need to know either of that for this book. It's just kind of a flex on their part, to be completely honest with you. Because I only bring that up because it's directly in the synopsis, as you guys saw. There is more I can say about this book, but I'm going to save it for later on because it's much more relevant then. But yeah, apart from what I'll talk about later, there's nothing much else I can really talk about when it comes to this book, because there's not much to say about this book, to be completely honest, in terms of background. Now this time, I'm going to put up the rating cards. However, you're going to notice a bit of a difference. Instead of me doing the test, which I'm beginning to realize are a bit limited in their scope, I might be changing it up. At least for the books like this, where, I'm going to include the tab total. And just for a quick refresher, for those of you unaware, pink is plot issues, such as plot holes, plot contrivances, things such as that. Orange is clunkiness. Basically, this is the part of the book that was just a struggle to read because, while not grammatically wrong or anything such as that, it's just, the way it's laid out is very clunky. Green is moments of pure cringe, where you're just like, really? When you read that section. Finally, yellow, which is objective errors. I'm talking things like typos, grammar errors. With that being said, here's a ratings card. Yeah. So, let's not delay this any further. Let's just get into this book. And we'll start where we always do. The cover. And honestly, what can I say about this cover that it doesn't say for itself? I mean, just look at it. It's everything about it is just wrong in a way. Every aspect of it has been photoshopped in, but not good. It's very obviously photoshopped. None of the actors or anything blend with each other. I know I just recently started doing Photoshop myself, but I feel like even I could have made a better background than this. A better cover than this with Photoshop. You have these two clearly milquetoast child models that they picked up offline that they just Photoshopped in on top of each other. Mixed with the dog that is a stand-in for Blake, even though, based on what I read, while it does kind of look right, it's not right because Blaze in the book is a mutt between a lab and a golden retriever, so it doesn't quite look like that. I mean, obviously, you'd probably have to search to find that. That's a minor complaint. Now, the big issue for me is the gigantic ship right behind them, for a number of reasons. The first, it's a completely different art style than the rest of the Photoshop. Like, the kids and the dog are just realistic models taken in and the background cut out. The ship itself looks like a very poor 3D model that was rendered for, like, a cutscene on some game. And then, in the very back, like, you can barely see it to the point where I wonder why they even included it at all. There's, like, this little house here. And it's like a manor. But, again, I don't know why they included it. In fact, nothing about this cover tells you anything about the book. There's really no emphasis on ships. While the two kids are important along with Blaze the dog, this doesn't really fit their personalities at all. Again, the house in the back makes no sense whatsoever because I just There's no point at which that's important. Overall, it's just on this boring blue night sky background, which, again, doesn't matter. That's the whole thing about the book. Night flight. Really, there's nothing about this book, nothing about this cover that tells you a thing about this book. Not even the title means anything to the book. Because there's, like, the only thing I can think of is night connects to the bad guy's plan, which is going out at night. And flight, go to an airport a bunch of times, but that's not directly connected to the kind of big bad guy's plan, so it's just like these two words sound similar. Smash them together. The back is where they keep the synopsis, which I already read on my TBR. If you want to, I read it there. I can't really promise you're going to learn anything. And with this being the last video of the things that I read on the TBR, I can't recommend going to check it out unless you just want to see some things I've talked about. In addition to that, it has that small little sentence up here on top, along with a couple of people talking about the review, talking about the book, reviewing it, to hype it up. And I want to know how much they had to pay these people to say some of this stuff. But, whatever. And apart from that, you get a picture of Diane and David Munson, which, in my research, I realized this must be the only picture they have, because that is the picture everywhere for them. So, yeah. Okay, I'm getting a little caught up on the cover. There's nothing good about it, and I can sit here and mock it for a bit longer, so I'll just move on. I'm just gonna jump from the cover into what's wrong with this book. Careful, boys and girls, and all Technicolor rainbow folk in between. This book is a mess in every sense of the word. Yeah, there's a reason I'm skipping over the synopsis, because honestly, I need to impress upon all of you just how bad this book is. Honestly, even if I wanted to, I could not go into the synopsis because this book is written so badly. It has such a lack of cohesion between the chapters that I don't know what I could tell you that this book is about, because the book isn't really about anything. This book literally stuffs itself with plots and subplots that don't mean anything, and they don't do anything to develop them properly. I mean, it says this book's about them using Blaze to fight crime. They don't do that. First of all, they aren't fighting crime just to fight crime out of a sense of justice. They're sniffing out people who might be smuggling stuff through an airport. Trust me, there's more to that later. To call in to a tip line and inform them, hey, yeah, we saw this person, and our dog says they might be smuggling stuff, so we put some orange tape on their bag, and they're going to this connecting flight. Please go there and arrest them. They're fighting crime in the most basic sense possible, which, again, there's so much I can say about this later on, but I'm going to prove a point. This is every plot and subplot within the book. 1, they discover a counterfeiting operation within their hometown, and they need a hideout in Florida because one of the guys got bail and is coming to try to silence them before he's prosecuted. 2, their neighbor Mason visits them in Florida and has to go back early after developing a sickness, only to reveal, oh no, he has cancer. So we need to pray to God, and we need to raise money for his cancer treatments because his parents can't afford them. 3, this homeless girl named Crystal is currently stealing food from the church every time they do an event. And Glenna, our main teenager character, wants to help her and bring her in because that is the Good Samaritan in the Bible. 4, there's a man within the Florida area. Well, there's a man with the Florida area where they're living with their grandparents who seems to be taking a group of people out in the middle of the night, out into international waters so they can illegally gamble before bringing them back. But wait, he's not just doing that. He's also smuggling drugs in and out of the country on his boss's boat, a boat he doesn't even own, but he's using because his boss lets him. 5, Glenna beginning to suspect that her father isn't actually a national recruiter for the government, but as actually a spy based on various things that have been happening throughout the book. 6, Greg, her little brother and the other sort of deuter protagonist, getting a metal detector from his grandpa, which he names Klondike, and trying to find the next big treasure within Florida. 7, Glenna and Greg attempting to train Blaze and bring back his ability to sniff out money so they can call in tips to this special informer tip line that'll give them payouts for every real tip that they give them. This does not connect to the Mason plotline, even though that they say that they're doing this to earn money for Mason's cancer. because they start to do it before Mason Mason helps them sign up before he even knows he has cancer, and they're already planning to do this. So this does count as a separate plotline. 8. Training Blaze to become Glenna's therapy dog. That way she can bring him wherever she wants without pause. And while at first you might think this is just them trying to get around the, well, they can't take Blaze in everywhere restriction that the real world would have, no. They repeatedly emphasize that Glenna really does have anxiety and nervous attacks, and Blaze really does help focus it a lot. 9. Glenna constantly worrying that Blaze is going to be taken back by the government and or his former handler when they realize that his money-sniffing abilities are still very good, and that doing everything in her power to both use his abilities but keep them secret so he isn't taken away from her. 10. Technically, this kind of falls back into the Crystal plotline, but I'm going to consider it its own separate plotline because of how much emphasis is placed on it outside of helping Crystal get out from being homeless. Well, I mean, apart from Glenna trying to be the Good Samaritan. So 10. Crystal's mother, who was said to have been sold to Colombian drug lords when she couldn't pay back a debt she incurred from the drugs, but in reality also trying to find the former foster parents that raised Crystal when she was initially taken away from her mother earlier on in the story, or early on in her life, not really knowing where to look for him because she doesn't remember their last name. And what she does remember, for some reason, everyone assumed when she says, the Fosters who raised me, they mean the, last name Fosters, not the Foster family. Despite the fact that this whole plotline could be easily resolved. I'm going to talk about this later. 11. Okay, no, you guys get the point. That is 10 separate plot lines for a book that is no more than 216 pages long. How do they cram 10 plot lines into a book that's barely over 200 pages? Well, let me tell you, they don't really. Because despite the fact that this book has 10 plus plot lines, nothing happens in this book. This book is full of such pointless meandering between the characters that you will go insane waiting for something just mildly interesting to happen. There are literally entire scenes in this book that don't amount to anything. I was being generous. Those plot lines I missed, those are just the ones that take up a either significant part of the story or interweave throughout the entire story. I didn't even talk about the random plot lines that show up for a single page or section of a chapter and then go away to nothing. Like the tornado that randomly hits them. Or the python that's in the yard that they have to call animal control for. There are just so many dead-end plot lines in here that you will go insane. Okay, it's just, oh, don't let me forget about this plot line, which acts like it's going to be at least a setup for the next book. No, okay. So when they finally do catch the guy from plotline 4 or 5 who's doing the illegal gambling operation, they manage to call the police on them and get them arrested. However, as they're watching the arrest, some guy that's described as having a lion-like mane is sitting there watching the proceedings. Despite being otherwise friendly and innocuous, Grandpa gets a very bad feeling from him and ushers his kids off before anything can happen. You later learn, oh no, this was the guy who was in charge all along of this operation. And you know what? The police caught him. Yeah, no, that's what that part of the story amounts to. All is set up for someone who it makes it seem like, oh, they're going to come back. Because they clearly thought they were going to get more than one book in this series. It's literally called the Truth Seeker series. This is the only book in the series, by the way, thank God. But this is called the Truth Seeker series. It's one, and there's nothing in it. This is the only book. And I would say, oh, maybe they plan to, but then they got told they can't right before it was going to end, so they quickly wrote out a quick end for that guy. No. If that was the case, they would not be advertising it on Amazon as book 1. They would not constantly put Truth Seeker series up here. I think even the back has it in the first, saying that this is the first book in this series. They really hype up that they're going to get a second book. So there was no excuse for, if they plan to use this guy later, to just have him arrested non-climactically at the end. Like I said, there's just so much wrong with this book in terms of plot and how it moves that you will be driven insane waiting for this plot to go anywhere. I legitimately mean it when I say there are several sections of this book where you could fall asleep. Flip 3 pages while you're sleeping, and then not miss a thing. And remember, this book is only 216 pages big. This isn't even getting how clunky the dialogue is. As you can notice in my little forest of tabs, I don't know how well you can see, but you can see a lot of orange. And that's because the dialogue here is so clunky. Just here's some examples of it.
Because Grandpa Crockett sends me war stuff. You hate it when I know something. Glenna crossed her arms. You are wrong. He got loose and sneaked over there.
Help me find a box marked Christmas so we can get out of here, she exclaimed. Greg grunted so.
I'm not gonna lie to you guys. I legitimately sat here for the first 100 pages reading every line a character spoke in a robot voice, because not only was it hilarious to me, but it was so fitting for the dialogue that it just felt appropriate. And that is sad. That really is sad. Dialogue is one of those things that I love to read because it can tell us about character. All this tells us is they probably need to go to a writing class. But no, like, in this dialogue, these characters don't feel real. These characters feel like cardboard cutouts with a small little electronic talking box attached to them that just talks at other people. No one has a conversation in this book. No, like, I'm not joking when I say those literal lines of dialogue that have 3 different conversations at once. And that's not even going into how the Munsons denote what's being said. Now, you know, most of us who are writers here know that one of the common advices that is given to us is don't say said. Said is it's a bland word. This is based on advice. It's not necessarily my belief, but this is based on advice that we often get. Said is such a bland word and doesn't convey much of the tone of what's being said. So they often say use other words, like to convey how this is being told to someone else. And the Munsons do attempt to do that, except they toss the denoting dialogue words into a lotto ball thing, spin it, and pull one out randomly. Characters will bark, snap, holler, whisper, hushfully scream, and hiss because it doesn't fit the rest of the dialogue or the tone of what's going on. There's like at one point where a character's like, hey, you know your father's a spy, and the other responds with, no, he's not! And then someone else responds with, yeah, you know what, you shouldn't, yeah, it's not, don't worry. It's just like the entire scene is very matter-of-fact in tone otherwise, but then they randomly throw in bits of dialogue, bits of denotion for the dialogue that completely changes the scene. But honestly, that's just a footnote in it all, because that just emphasizes a bigger point. This book is inconsistent as hell. Let's start with Glenna, the teenager who should have been at least 10 years old, because she does not act like a teenager. She is the most inconsistent character in all of this. One minute she goes from being too scared to go into a barber shop because she doesn't like, she's nervous around new people and is scared that something's gonna go wrong if she goes in and tries to converse. And then the next minute, she's taking her dog Blaze into an airport to sniff out smugglers, despite the fact that not only is she in Florida, hiding from counterfeiters who want to kill her and her brother, but also she's been threatened in the airport itself and still sits there and pushes her dog to find hidden money so she can report them. Literally, even when the dog finds it and she's sitting there trying to say, oh no, he's a therapy dog, I'm sorry, you must have dog treats that he's noticing. She'll get that excuse and be like, go get the money, please. Get it. Pick one. She can't both be this daring detective who wants to solve crime despite the dangers, but then also too scared to go into a barbershop and talk to someone. You know what? Let's go back to that barbershop scene. Let's talk about that barbershop scene. She goes there purely to learn about the smuggling operation, the gambling operation I talked about earlier. See, the guy who's been using the boat has been otherwise hurtful, and they have noticed some strange things. So their grandpa takes him here to this barbershop to learn some of the rumors about this guy, see if it helps narrow down what he's doing. As her grandpa and Greg are talking to this guy about what's going on with this boat, all of a sudden Glenna gets all high and mighty being like, well, we shouldn't gossip. You know, Mother says if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. And it's just, that's the whole reason you came here. The whole reason you came here was to learn rumors about this. Why are you suddenly getting high and mighty about gossip when gossip was the reason you came? Just... Oh my god. And there's a whole father spy subplot, which at one point she gets angry and mad at someone for suggesting that her father might be a spy. And then in the literal next paragraph, she's like, you know what? I bet my dad's a spy. That's so cool, isn't it? I'd rather think he's a spy than just a recruiter. And then the next paragraph, she's like, I don't want him to be a spy. That's too dangerous. It's just, make up your mind. Seriously. Oh my god, this book drove me insane. Because of how often the character would flip-flop. She literally does 180s faster than a revolving door. That's all I'm gonna say. But no. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to a point I made earlier. They say Glenna is supposed to be 15/16 in this. They say 15 at one point, but she's in Florida for so long. There's no way that she doesn't turn 16. But they say Glenna is 15 or 16 in this book. This girl is 8 at most. The Diane and David Munson clearly don't know how to write a teenager. Even if they may have one, they clearly don't know how to write a teenager. When she finds out her dad, she's going to Camp David for a few days. You know, most teenagers at that time have a fair understanding that if your father works for a government and is called to a government facility for something, you know, it's probably fairly important. They may get upset that their dad is missing important events, but you know what? They at least know that what their dad is doing is part of their job. Glenna, in her 15-year-old wisdom, thinks her father is going to Camp David for a gigantic summer camp for the government employees. That is not me joking. I wish I was. Literally, I believe the exact line is, Dad should be home for Christmas, not out camping with his coworkers. And it's just, are you fucking 5? What the Oh, no. Okay, let me get this. This one's my favorite. So, when we finally meet Crystal and Glenna's convinced her to come in and they're basically housing and feeding her while they try to find her mother and foster parents. Glenna talks to Crystal and learns that how when she was with her foster family, they would celebrate Christmas by going to church, you know, going singing Christmas hymns, and how greatly she just enjoyed that season with her foster family. So from all this, Glenna, our regular Nancy Drew, concludes, so the Fosters celebrate Christmas. Oh my god, Glenna, I'm glad you could figure that out. I wouldn't have been able to tell any other way. Definitely not when she sat there and said, we sing Christmas hymns. The only reason I can conclude that the Munsons made Glenna a teenager, well, there's 2 reasons. The first is that this is actually a sequel. I'll go more into this a bit later. But this is actually a sequel book, and they must have already stated Glenna's age in that book. Therefore, in order for the book to have a consistent timeline, they had to make Glenna 15. But they didn't really want to commit to her growing up. So they just kept her at the age she was in those previous books. Again, this is me assuming. I've never read those books, and honestly, after reading this one, I don't think I'm going to try. I need my sanity. The second reason is I think they were trying to create an excuse why Glenna and Greg have so much freedom in comparison. Because Glenna is a teenager, and therefore, most part, although parents are protective, they tend to understand that teenagers can handle themselves a little better than a 10-year-old going out by themselves. In that regard, I don't know why they bothered, because both Glenna and Greg are the most unwatched children in existence. I'm not one to sit here and throw stones from my glass house, but there's a bit of a difference between that and the fact that their grandpa, mind you, they're in Florida because Glenna and Greg sniffed out a counterfeiting operation in their hometown, and one of the counterfeiters, again, is out on bail and is actively looking for them to silence them so he doesn't go to jail. When I tell you that, what do you think the grandpa does to protect his grandkids? Well, obviously, he takes them to the airport so they can take their dog to sniff out smugglers in the airport. Because, nothing says low profile than walking a dog around the airport, having them constantly growl and bark at bags, and then that person getting arrested on their next stop because they're smuggling money. I wonder if dots can be connected there. Oh, but you think that's the worst part? Well, what about that time that the grandpa, when the the illegal gambling operation goes out to sea to meet the drug runners, so he can load up his boat and transfer a whole bunch of money to them, he decides, I'm going to follow that boat. Quick! My 10-year-old grandson, that 10-year-old runaway girl that I took in, and my 15-year-old granddaughter, get in this boat so we can follow the dangerous men we know have guns. Oh, do you think that's the worst? Well, what about this? When they first see this guy loading up his yacht with the money, what do you think they do? Do you think they say, hey, maybe we should stay away from that and call the police? We know that he has money, but we also know that he's armed. We should be reasonable and let the authorities handle this. No. The grandpa's like, okay, my 15-year-old granddaughter and you, the 10-year-old runaway girl, to this area and watch the drug lords smuggle their money onto the yacht, that while I start up my boat so we can chase them. And you know what? Forget the fact that we think that, the 10-year-old runaway's mother was sold to Colombian drug lords because, look, anyone who's an adult knows exactly why she would be sold to Colombian drug lords, let's be real. But just, it was like Munsons could not think of a way that they would have the freedom to do their little Encyclopedia Brown shenanigans throughout the book, so they decided to just make the grandpa the most irresponsible person in the world. You know what? I even say that, but the mother and grandma also get in on it, although at times the mother is with a more reasonable voice saying, why would you do that? But she never actually stops them. So, about this time, some of you are probably saying, why are you being so harsh on this book? Isn't it written for kids? And you know what? Maybe. It says it is. And, honestly, in my opinion, if it is, that's worse. It really is. I looked it up. The premise alone and the type of writing it is very much screams kids' book to me. So I had to look it up to figure it out. But even then, even with that in mind, this book is still awful. And you guys know I try to be fairer based on what the book is. A debut novel won't be as harshly critiqued as the 10th novel. A self-published work isn't going to be critiqued as harshly as a professional published work. And a kid's book isn't going to be held to the same standards as an adult book. Even holding this to kids' book standards, this book is awful. And you know what? I don't know if it was written as a kid's book. I know they call it a kid's book, but there are several points in this book that I'm like, there's no way this was written for kids. There's a couple of things in this book that directly references stuff that only adults would know. Like NCIS. Yeah, I know the author himself is an NCIS agent, but the book itself references NCIS to the point there is literally a character in this book named Anthony DiNozzo. But don't worry, it's not this DiNozzo. See, the DiNozzo in this book, it's spelled with an E. Yeah, it's a different character. But the big issue I had with this book is a direct sequel to a book that they've written previously called The Joshua Covenant, which, no offense, I read the synopsis, The Joshua Covenant does not sound like a kid's book. Here's the Joshua Covenant synopsis.
God's covenants to his people take center stage as CIA agent Bo Ryder races to help Israel defeat a dangerous enemy amidst unfolding Bible prophecy. After years of clandestine spying, Bo's new assignment plunges him into Middle East intrigue at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, where he is
Speaking of the Joshua Covenant, that's a neat little trivia about this book. Did you know they referenced the Joshua Covenant several times in this book? Yeah, that's the only reason I know the Joshua Covenant exists. Now, why is that an issue? One, this book labels itself as a completely different series. The first couple times I looked up this book, I didn't find the Joshua Covenant because this is labeled as the Truth Seeker series. It's a completely different series from the Joshua Covenant. They reference heavily stuff that happens in the Joshua Covenant. And two, like I said, if this book is written for kids, the Joshua Covenant does not sound like a book written for kids. And they make so many references to it, even I was like, what? Because the references they make aren't small little nice tidbits. There are direct references that are made that make you stop and say, okay, no, you cannot just gloss over that with no explanation. Like in the first few pages, where Glenna's learning to drive and references how a jet exploded above her head, and then just moves on with the conversation. And I was sitting there like, no. You go back to that and explain what that was. Or like how Glenna constantly references how she found God within the Joshua Covenant because she was hiding in the catacombs in Israel while men were searching for her with like baseball bats or something. That's what it said. I'm pretty sure it wasn't baseball bats, but it's like that's what it references. Which again, they just gloss over. Like they're like, oh yeah, I remember that time where I was hunted for sport in the catacombs beneath Israel. That was wild. Anyways, this drug sniffing dog, like, no, like you go back and you explain that reference because that is clearly not just a random tidbit you pull. That is not a spaghetti incident. You explain it. So this book wants to be its own series, but also relies heavily on what came before to the point that you need to read what came before to understand stuff in this series. And if this is a kid's book, and this isn't, how is this a kid's book? And okay, there's no point in putting it off forever, but this book is very, very religious. Now, at first, this didn't bother me. As I've said before, you can put religion in your book so long as you weave it organically within the narrative and the nature of the story. One of the aspects I put in the last layover when I criticized it was not that it had religion in it, but rather that the clunky ways it used religion, i.e. to mock people that were currently suffering, just felt wrong. So, initially, with this book, I didn't pay much mind to it. I expected it to be religious, especially when I found out that it's advertised on a Christian website for Christian authors. So obviously I expected it. Honestly, one of my big issues with the book at first was that they didn't take an opportunity to talk about religion in a scenario where it would have fit organically and chose to basically wrench it in later. Like, there's at one point where Glenna is worried that her father is going to stop loving them because he spends so much time away from the family. How, because he's not constantly around them, he's not constantly aware of their existence, his love for them will dry up. And there was a really neat opportunity here for Glenna and her mother to talk about faith in general. How faith isn't about constantly seeing what's in front of you, but believing it's going to remain there. And, and then they just skip that and then wrench in later on Glenna praying. And it's just one of those, it could have worked better if you stuck with the through line. But then as the book goes on, it gets worse. It stops just kind of being a background, and Munson's just kind of shove it in, but not in a way that fits with the story. In fact, at several points, there were times where the religion is portrayed in such a way that it's very indicative of problematic beliefs and practices by the church. A specific example for me was when they took Crystal to church with them on a Sunday. At this point, what we know about this girl is that she is a runaway who's been living on the streets for nearly 2 years, hasn't had a full meal in very long, to the point where she's so well known at like the McDonald's that the moment Glenna tries to take her in to buy some food, the McDonald's workers try to kick her out because they know her face. So obviously you have a vulnerable young girl who for the first time in her life the first time in a long while is receiving care and is starting to live comfortably again. So obviously her emotional barriers and the vulnerability she has is far higher than it would normally be. So the scene where she breaks down in church, begs the preacher for forgiveness because of her transgressions, doesn't feel like a triumph for me. It feels like the church taking advantage of a vulnerable state of a young girl to reconvert her back to the religion. I have my issues with stuff like that, such as Alcoholics Anonymous making religion a big part of their recovery program. That's one of those I very much dislike it, but that's not things I'm going to go into today. There's also things like when things get tough in Glenna's life, her reaction isn't, I'm going to try to fix it or I'm going to try to do things. It's just, I'm going to pray and then I'm going to do things by myself, fix it, and then give credit to God. Like the entire reason Mason, the neighbor, has cancer is so they can shove in religion whenever they feel like. Anytime they talk about Mason, they will bring up the fact that this problem is beyond humans. We must pray to God that Mason gets better. Despite the fact that one of the subplots is getting money so Mason can have a procedure that can't be paid for. It's just one of those, either commit harder or commit less to the religion. Don't be doing this thing that you have right in the middle, where it's if I cut out every bit of religious references and speak in this book, the book would play out mostly the same. In fact, I'd cut down a bit. It'd probably be easier to read. This one quote in the book sums it up perfectly for me.
You can fuss, but I'm going to do something, Glenna cried, leaping from the chair. Like what? Like asking God for help. This is way too big for you and me.
Apart from that, every other complaint that I have left is mostly smaller nitpick kind of complaints. Like how occasionally a character will just suddenly appear in a scene because the Munsons need him there. But there was no prior setup to him being there. One such is when they find out that when the kids find out that Blaze has the ability to sniff out the ink and money, and Anthony DiNozzo, Blaze's former handler, comes in to see if he hasn't lost his touch. Basically wasn't just growling at people to be mad. Halfway through that scene, suddenly Mason just appears, and he wasn't there before. The book never referenced him being there until they needed him to say something. So he literally just pops into existence out of nowhere. There's also really wonky timetables, where the only time you have a decent grasp of how long something's been is when they directly state it to you. Because otherwise you have things where like they call the cops and then like 5 seconds later cops are screaming by them to respond to the threat. And it's either just an example of really bad time conveyance or just a really over faithfulness in the cops themselves. What about when, I guess I kind of already said this, but what about how the main plot doesn't even start until halfway through the book, is ignored from the rest of the book, and then pops back up in the last few pages to wrap up? Or the fact that one of the things that began to really annoy me is when we find out Crystal's backstory, that she was a crack baby or a cocaine baby or a crack cocaine baby, because it changes every time they talk about it. Crack and cocaine are not the same thing, just so we're clear. How after she says that, almost every single time that they refer to Crystal's backstory afterwards, they call her a crack baby. I'm not a crack baby, but I was getting offended by how often they just referred to Crystal as, she's the crack baby. Yeah, that crack baby that we adopted. Yeah, this crack baby here is seeking God, so we need to pray for her. Let's do a donation for the crack baby. She's 10. Move on from that. That you are just being insulting at this rate. And then there's like statements and scenes in this book that are just so mind-numbingly dumb, so shockingly stupid, that you have to close the book, sit there, and think for a long moment that this is a published work that you picked up and somehow convinced yourself to read. And the fact that all of this is written for kids. Three out of 10. It honestly pains me to say this, and believe me, I would not say this under any circumstance unless it was true, but this book is objectively worse than The Last Layover. Let me explain. The Last Layover is overall, in my opinion, a much worse book than this. The Last Layover is much more offensive and just a libertarian wet dream that doesn't consider how the world actually works. Specifically speaking, at least The Last Layover had both consistent characters, even if I hated those characters, and a consistent narrative, neither of which this book has. This book isn't offensive, really, in any way, to be completely honest. it's just so stupid that it feels offensive. And because of that, again, objectively speaking, it is the worst book. It feels like it walks back and forth aimlessly in the middle of the road, hoping to be hit by a semi, but that semi never comes. It never hits you. In fact, several times, a car will come around the corner, you think this is finally the end, and it'll just drive around you. And it's just... I cannot recommend this book to anyone at all. If you want to punish your kids this Christmas, give them this book. That's going to be worse than any kind of coal you can give them. But if you're looking for any kind of kid story to give them, I beg you, give them anything else. Give them another book I talked about called The Great Griffins. I didn't like that book either, but at least that book is trying to be a good book. This book feels like it's trying to coast by solely off of preying on the Christian audience simply because they include some references to God here. This deserves Mount Doom. With that, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the ones that make you want to yank your hair out of your head. Stay tuned till next time, guys.